that's really, really, really good, but aren't you supposed to be playing it with your feet?
Last month I mentioned Home Alone in passing. My brothers and I would watch the VHS over and over again, and one of the trailers before the film was Big. I've not seen the film in full before, only the trailer, and this is a classic 80s movie. My average with 80s classics is spotty at best. Dirty Dancing, Little Shop of Horrors and The Lost Boys were enjoyable, but I wasn't a fan of The Goonies or The Dark Crystal. It's time to grow up fast. Here's my review of Big. Josh is a normal 12-year-old boy, hanging out with his best friend Billy, playing baseball and having a crush on recently single girl Cynthia. One night at a carnival, Josh queues up to ride one of the roller coasters alongside Cynthia, but not only is she there with an older boy who drives, but Josh is not tall enough to go on the ride. Dismayed, Josh spots a fortune-telling machine called Zoltar. Josh makes a wish to be big and Zoltar gives out a card saying his wish is granted. Oddly though, Josh discovers the machine isn't plugged in. The next morning, Josh wakes up as a 29-year-old man. He manages to sneak out the house without his mum noticing the change and heads to where the carnival was. Unfortunately, they've moved on and so has Zoltar. Josh goes back home to try and explain to his mum what's happened, but she, seeing a strange grown-up man entering the house talking about her son wearing his underwear, chases him out the house. Josh then heads to school to find Billy, and after a couple of minutes, Josh convinces Billy that he is the same person. Billy's idea after seeing a police presence outside Josh's house is to take Josh to New York City, put him up in a hotel until they find the Zoltar machine. Given that this is the 1980s, there's no internet to find the carnival, and so they file a request with the Department of Consumer Affairs, who say they'll have an answer in 6 weeks. This means Josh needs a job, and after a short amount of time, he gets a data entry job at Macmillan Toys. Josh does well and catches the eye of Mac, the owner of Macmillan Toys, specifically on his day off at a toy store where they play a duet on a giant floor piano. Josh is promoted to Vice President of Product Development, much to the chagrin of Paul, who can't figure out where Josh has come from, especially when Josh inadvertently torpedoes Paul's presentation about robot toys transforming into buildings. At a company party, Josh catches the eye of Susan, Paul's girlfriend. The two head back to Josh's place, but they have different ideas. They end up bouncing on a trampoline and sleeping on bunk beds. After Paul and Josh get into a fight over a game of racquetball, Susan breaks up with Paul and gets together with Josh. Josh's life gets more complicated and grown up, given a huge project at work, getting serious with Susan and having less and less time for Billy, who's managed to locate the Zoltar machine. Billy yells at Josh and gives him the location. Later that night, Josh tries to tell Susan the truth, but she too does not understand until Josh leaves their huge presentation halfway through to find the Zoltar machine. Susan catches up to him, but it's too late. Josh has already made the wish and it's been granted. Susan takes him back to his home and the two say their goodbyes. Josh transforms back into a child as he walks back to his house. I don't like this film. The more I think about it, the more I don't like about it. It would be easy to say switch your brain off to enjoy it, but unlike Weird Science, Big is not over the top enough to do that. So what is it I don't like? Well, let's start with the story. There's a defense that this is 12-year-old boy logic to some of these points, but let's start with the fact that Josh doesn't try to convince his mother more than once about who he really is. Instead, he convinces her that he's been kidnapped. Speaking of, how come the police didn't track him down? They had a phone call which they probably should have been listening to, and a handwritten letter. Not much is made of the fact that Josh's mum is suffering at home, aside from one scene where she speaks to Billy one evening, shortly after Josh's birthday. Moving on, Billy manages to travel to New York City by bus a lot, and even gets into the office at Macmillan Toys. This is a 12-year-old boy who seems to have no issue moving around, and whose parents don't seem to notice. He says he's told them that he's made the basketball team, but surely, especially with Billy's best friend and neighbour missing, they'd be extra careful around Billy, surely. Billy at one point suggests that they use Josh being older to buy alcohol and dirty magazines. He suggests this very late into the film, when Josh has already been an adult for several weeks. Not to be cliche, but wouldn't a 12-year-old suggest this sooner? Now, I don't know much about American payroll, but wouldn't a made-up social security number be found out very quickly? And finally, by far and away, the biggest thing is the fact that Josh and Susan slept together. This happens shortly after Josh's birthday, so technically his body is 30, but he's actually 13.
Not okay!
Can you imagine if this was the other way round? A 13-year-old girl in a 30-year-old's body. Wait, that's a Jennifer Garner movie, 13 going on 30, isn't it? I really hope she didn't sleep with anyone in that film. With Big, the implications have not aged well, but the lesson of the film is actually kind of nice. It's a simple story about not wishing your life away and enjoying your childhood whilst you can. Also, be careful what you wish for. There's a really good cast here. I recognise Tom Hanks, of course, as Josh, and I'll come back to him in just a moment. I like Elizabeth Perkins as Susan, although her character change is pretty dramatic, going from Paul's girlfriend to interested in Josh to basically in love with him very quickly. It's only Susan and Josh that get any development though. Other names I recognise from elsewhere include John Lovitz, Paul Hurd, Mercedes Rule, and
Robert Loggia.
The character of Josh actually went through several casting choices, and although Tom Hanks was always the first choice, he wasn't initially available. Names including Harrison Ford, Kevin Costner, John Travolta, Sean Penn and Andy Garcia were either interested or considered for the role. Robert De Niro was actually cast for a while, but dropped out and replaced by Tom Hanks a year after he was initially offered the role. Tom Hanks was nominated for Best Actor in the role, but I don't think his performance is that great. There are times he acts a lot younger than he should, and a lot more naive. Now granted, I wasn't a 12-year-old in the 1980s, but to me, it's not his best performance, although even the weakest Tom Hanks performance is still pretty good. It didn't hurt his career though. It's often cited as his first big role, pun very much intended. Big did do well too. $151.7 million box office on an $18 million budget. And as well as the Best Actor nomination, it was also nominated for Best Original Screenplay. Rain Man beat them in both categories. Big didn't really click with me. Now that being said, I don't hate it. I think some parts of it are pretty charming. Well, let's face it, that piano scene is iconic, and it really strikes a chord with the audience. The original piano that inspired the scene was only 6 feet across, and so one was made especially for the film, and it now resides at Macy's in New York. Tom Hanks and Robert Loggia had stunt doubles who could do the dance in case they couldn't, but they nailed it, and it's clear to see why this is the most remembered scene. I think it's a shame that this is the only real bonding experience we have between the two though. Aside from the carnival very early on, there is no sign of Josh's dad in the film. You could have had Mac be a surrogate father figure to Josh and have a metaphorical battle for Josh's soul between him and Billy. Instead, Josh leaves during a pitch meeting and is never seen again, at least from Mac's point of view. Good luck explaining that one, Susan. You know, for the first time in a while, I have to talk about a film being made into a musical again. Between 1996 and 2019, there have been several productions of Big the Musical. It did get some acclaim, eventually, and I wonder if the creative license has taken away that big ick factor I mentioned earlier. This might be the most controversial opinion I've had in the Film Review Open Challenge so far. I don't like Big. As much as the premise is interesting, and there have been a lot of films to do this kind of thing, I feel that the way in which things get done just doesn't sit right with me. This being my first viewing as a 37-year-old parent, I see things differently than a younger person who maybe this film is targeted to. Big has not aged well in my opinion, and I'm sorry to say, it's a big disappointment. Next up for the Film Review Open Challenge is Saving Private Ryan. For now though, thank you very much for watching.